Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about the 2026 F1 regulations. Have you been reading the proposed regs and wondering how they will impact F1 racing in 2026? Well, John, Dick, and I had been discussing the regs offline when one of our listeners, Russell, suggested that we do an episode. I didn't have to pull Dick's arm to get him to say yes. But before we get to the conversation, I need to take a moment to ask, have you subscribed to or followed the show on your favorite podcast app? Have you shared the show with your fellow F1 fans? If not, can you take a moment to do so now? For an indie podcast like us, that's how we grow. To those who have already done so, the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, I'm having a bit of a challenge. Can you help me?
I'm always willing to roll up my sleeve and see what I can do. What do you got?
Okay, here's my deal. These F1 regs have come out, or these proposed regs have come out, and I have been listening, I have been reading and trying to process. And as we know, we've been doing this tech series, so I feel a greater level of confidence, but obviously I'm never going to be like professor here and know all this stuff. But I'm walking away kind of confused. And of course, there's lots of different opinions. And I thought, well, I really would like the opinion of Dick on this. And I should highlight, some of our listeners have reached out and asked for this conversation. So it just only validated that, you know what, this is something we should do. And so here's what I'd request. Can you help unpack these proposed 2026 regs and, give your opinion? Obviously, you're not an insider inside the FIA or F1, but you are a racer and you do have your technical background. And I think it would just help the rest of us try to process what has already come out. And my understanding is even this is still an evolving situation. So, of course, it could change, but this is based off of what you know or what you've heard.
Right. Hey, I'm willing to take a stab at it. The engine regs have been out there for a couple of years now, so there's that piece of the puzzle. But the chassis regs are brand new, and so I think that there is going to be a situation where the teams demand that there be some changes made to those regs. But that's conjecture on my part. So I'm happy to help, but I've got to make the disclaimer because I don't think anybody really knows what to expect because all of this is so new. People are still digesting it. There's a lot of chatter out there, some of it negative or some of it where people are withholding opinion. They're saying, well, it could be this, but it could be that. And so I think the thing that we really need to do here is if we're going to piece this thing together, we sort of need to say, okay, what was the overall goals or what were the goals that the FIA had in mind when they drafted these regulations, right? Keeping in mind that you've got engine regs, you've got chassis regs. And then with that overall goal, then what does that really mean into what kind of car we're going to be looking at? And then I think just because I have certain opinions, everybody has an opinion. I always say about how many opinions there are out there. But anyway, I'd like to throw some ideas out there, and then hopefully that answers your questions. But hey, if you have more, then let's talk about them.
That sounds perfect.
All right. So if we just take the 50,000-foot view of what the FIA was trying to do, they wanted to come up with what they call the nimble car concept, right? Because the cars that we have today are probably some of the biggest F1 cars that have ever been built dimensionally. They're longer, they're wider, they're definitely heavier. No question, they're really, really fast. As we can see from, what's been going on really since about the 1st of May, the field is definitely getting closer as teams' understanding of these regulations mature. And so the nimble car concept basically had about 3 different things that they were trying to target. One, improved raceability, closer racing. Closer racing has been something that the FIA has been chasing, I would say, for at least 20 years because it's just so hard to pass because of the aerodynamic wash that is coming off the car in front, killing all the downforce or a lot of the downforce on the following cars. So how do we combat that? And then of course they're always looking at new ways to improve safety, right? So those were really the three principal areas: better raceability, closer racing, and then improve safety. So with the regs, with that in mind, and we're talking chassis regs here, the new cars will be about 30 kilograms lighter than the cars that we're seeing today. And that should improve the efficiency of the car, improve the handling, improve the braking, all of that kind of stuff. They're going to have what's called active aerodynamics. And those active aerodynamics will come into play where they're actually able to have movable front and rear wings. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, the idea is the driver is going to be able to increase or decrease downforce depending on what part of the track he's on. There should be new overtaking opportunities because there will be, instead of DRS, there will be a manual override mode, which is really, if you're an IndyCar fan, you know that as push to pass. And so, but in this case, it'll be just deploying more electrical power for a car that is trying to get around the car in front. There's going to be better safety just because of stronger chassis and even tougher crash tests. And then from an engine standpoint, the power unit will be very interesting in that it will still be an internal combustion engine that's mated to an electrical generation system. And the difference is that while the power on the gas-powered engine is going to go down, there's going to be a huge jump in power from the electrical motors. So for an overall, sounds like net increase in power. They're going to run on 100% sustainable fuel, which is very interesting. That should make Sebastian Vettel very happy. And because the power unit regulations are so interesting and have so much application to road cars, we now have a situation where Audi, Honda is re-upping, and Red Bull and Ford have their partnership. They're all jumping on board for this 2026 engine formula, along with the guys that have been there all along, Ferrari, Mercedes, and Alpine. So really, really interesting mix of engines. Obviously, a lot more manufacturer interest. I mean, you can argue that, Ford going with Red Bull, well, Red Bull's already building engines in partnership with Honda, but nonetheless, bringing Ford on board, pretty interesting stuff. So that's the 50,000 foot level. If we take a little bit of a deeper dive and talk about, okay, what does this really mean? What's the cars going to look like? Well, the aerodynamics are going to be a bit simpler. The cars will feature a partially flat floor instead of a full-on ground effect car, and the diffuser at the rear of the car will be less effective. And this is going to reduce the ground effect, and thus the cars will not have to run as stiff on the suspensions because, as we've talked before, when you run a ground effect car, the faster you go, the more downforce you produce. And the only way to keep the belly of the car from grinding itself off on the surface of the track is to put stiffer springs to keep the car from collapsing on itself. So the car is going to be able to run softer springs, and they're going to be able to run maybe a little bit more ride height as well, because ride height will not be nearly as critical. We talked about the cars being 30 kilograms lighter, but we also talked about them being a little bit smaller. The wheelbase, which is the distance between the center of the front wheel to the center of the rear wheel, that's the wheelbase, it's going to be about 200 millimeters shorter than today's car. 200 millimeters is roughly 8 inches. And the cars themselves will be about 100 millimeters narrower, so about 4 inches narrower. So at a place like Monaco, that might be a little bit more helpful to help the car maneuver a little bit better. You go with a long wheelbase, it's not as nimble, and certainly that little bit narrower front track and rear track, that will also make the car at least fit on those narrow streets. So it should be kind of interesting. The whole active aerodynamics That's really interesting because this means that the front and rear wings can be deployed depending on where you are on the track. So the driver is able to go in, activate the wing, and increase the rake of the wing for the corners to increase downforce, and then lay them flat when they go down the straightaways. Really interesting concept there. And we saw adjustable wings in the late 1960s, and they were banned for safety reasons. And now here we are, 60 years later almost. And guess what? We have adjustable wings again. So talk about it coming around full circle. Some of the other pieces of information, the tires will still be on 18-inch wheels, but they're going to be narrower by about an inch at the front and a little over an inch narrower at the rear. Interestingly enough, not only they're going with a flat floor and a less effective diffuser, but the floor itself will be reduced in width by about 150 millimeters, which is about 6 inches. So all of these changes are going to result in, get this, a drop in downforce of about 30% and a drag reduction of almost 55% less drag, which is absolutely crazy. Anyway, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Those front wheel arches that are on the cars today, they're going to be removed, which I'm glad because they're really ugly. Again, the fuel is made to be fully sustainable, so that's a really good thing. So there's a lot of really, really big changes here. I think the other thing that's really interesting is, and of course, the engines have been on the test beds. It's really interesting. They get the rules. And so what do the manufacturers do? You'd think that they'd build up an engine and test it. No, what they're doing is they're building an engine, but it's only got one cylinder. But it's, instead of being 1.6 liters, it's 160 cc's, maybe turbocharged. And they're going through all the runs on the dynamometer just for the simplicity, because they figure, well, we'll go and test all our concepts. We'll get it right on a single cylinder engine, and then we'll build the proper V6. So ultimately what's going to happen is that engine is going to produce about 25% less horsepower than the engines of today. But the electric motor is going to produce 3 times the power of today's engines. So really what's going to happen is you're going to have a net overall increase in power. So now that we've taken that kind of deep dive and we kind of thought about this, the 50,000 foot view, and then we've taken a little bit deeper dive, what does all this mean? Well, in my opinion, it means that if these cars, if their power, drag reduction, weight goals, all those are met, these things are going to be absolute rockets in a straight line. And George Russell has some thoughts about that, and we'll talk about it. On the other hand, with the reductions in downforce and mechanical grip, because again, we're talking about a significant drop in downforce. Tires are going to be a little bit narrower, so some mechanical grip's going to go away. The cars are going to be way slower in the corners. So if you think about circuit safety for a minute, the circuits of today are designed with runoff areas that take into account the speed of the cars in the corners themselves. Okay. Now, with cars that are so fast on the straightaways, there needs to be consideration of how much more runoff room is needed at the end of the straightaways in case there's a brake failure or if one car hits another in the braking zone and they go smashing off the track. There's just not enough room to slow them down because they're going to be going so much faster. Some people are good saying they could be over 50 miles an hour faster on the longest straightaways than what they're doing today. Think about it, 50 miles an hour. That's crazy. For every 60 miles an hour, you're traveling 88 feet per second. So, you're almost going an extra 88 feet per second faster with this car. So the potential for calamity is greater on the straightaways now. Obviously, with the reduced power from the ICE, for the internal combustion engine, 25% reduction in power. Guess what? The engine noise is going to be at least as muted as the current spec engine, if not more so. And so as a purist, I hate the sound of these cars anyway. So I had hoped that there would be something that would make the cars sound a little bit more beastly. I'm guessing that's not going to be the case. And that's hugely disappointing. I know progress is progress, but sometimes maybe progress isn't better. And for those of you who wonder about what I'm talking about, just go out onto YouTube and do a search for the sound of a Ferrari 644 F1 car. That's from about, early 1990s. It's a V12. And listen to that. And then listen to a modern day Formula One. You tell me which one sounds better. Now, one thing that could be really interesting is that if you make the car really fast on the straights and really slow in the corners, that might mean that it will become more possible to outbrake an opponent into a corner. And so it could be a much more common thing because more speed has to be bled off prior to that corner. So there could be more overtaking during a race. Not saying that there is, but it sounds like to me that may be where driver brilliance under the brakes might be something that would really shine. And I think because there's so much more manufacturer interest, this should make for a very interesting manufacturer's battle. And really, let's not forget, General Motors has said that they wanted to jump in with Andretti. And I know that they subsequently said, well, even if Andretti doesn't join, we might do it in 2028. So we'll see about that. However, having said all that, within the F1 community, based on what I'm seeing, the drivers and the teams are saying that the reduction in weight, that 30 kilogram weight that they're talking about, it's highly unlikely, as the increased electrical power of the bigger motor is going to require a much bigger battery, and therefore it's going to require more weight. The cars have been given initial runs by some of the drivers in their own simulators, and it's indicating that the cars are going to be considerably slower, even though they're going to be so much faster down the straightaways. It's not going to make up for the lack of pace through the corners. And so some of them are saying that the new car is going to be barely faster than a current F2 car. And some are even calling the new F1 car a Formula F2.5. So in other words, they're not really all that impressed by the car. They're looking at several seconds actually being being slower than what we're looking at today. And I don't know how I feel about cars that look slow in the corners. If they look nimble, then I'm okay with that. And if they are absolute beasts, I mean, think about it, 900 to 1,000 horsepower, and 30% less downforce than the cars today, man, they're going to be sliding around and they're going to look like a real handful, which will actually allow the really, really cream of the crop drivers to rise to the top. I like that. But if the cars are too slow, then the teams and the drivers are worried that Formula One will no longer be the pinnacle of motorsport, because series like Super Formula in Japan or IndyCar here in the United States and Canada, they're going to be faster. IndyCar is adding horsepower literally a month from now. They're bumping up their hybridization, and they're packaging in a hybrid program that's going to add a whole lot more horsepower to their cars. So if Formula One wants to remain at the pinnacle, they're probably going to have to think about that. And then George Russell, who is, the president of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, he's very concerned about the straight line speed of the cars, especially since it looks like about 250 miles an hour is possible. So how does that work on a street circuit like Baku, or worse, Jeddah, where the walls are right there? Can you imagine what would happen if you cut down a tire going 250 miles an hour, or if it suddenly starts raining and everybody's on slicks and you're going 250 miles an hour? How bad is that wreck going to be? So that said, George supports the overall general concept of what the FIA is trying to achieve, but he's just got his reservations. And I think that sums up what the team principals are saying. It's all like, yep, this is a good direction, but how we get there, maybe we need to think about it a little bit more. So overall, I think this is a working process, and I suspect that the teams will work to get the regulations changed somewhat to restore more downforce at the expense of having more drag, because as we've discussed before, as downforce goes up, so does drag. So they may be quicker in the corners, but they'll be slower on the straights. So I think this is a conversation that has just started, and I think we're going to see some revisions to the rules in the coming months, which we'll, of course, be following with a great deal of interest. So that's it. That's the high level story. Any questions?
Oh, yes, Professor. Many questions, both from our pre-recording and then now hearing you talk. I have even more questions. But I have to
Sure.
say, Dick, I say this all the time, but I really appreciate your ability to break down, make these pieces of information approachable for people like me. I think it's actually very invaluable to the sport. And I say that as your
Well,
friend
thank
and
you.
fellow co-host. What you have said really helps clarify a lot for me and gives me a better understanding of the technical side of the sport. So I want to say thank you before I launch into a myriad of questions.
Sure.
So
My pleasure.
here's what I'll start with. I did think it was interesting when you talked about the active wings because it did make me remember, I think it was our Aero 101 conversation where you talked about how dangerous it was back
Right.
then for them to do this. And so when I read this or heard somebody saying this, I thought, surely not, because Dick said that was a bad thing back then. And now
Right.
to hear you say that I'm not misunderstanding, that's super helpful. And I
Yep.
appreciate you saying that we've come full circle. Hopefully, technology and regulations and all the other components that are going to go into this will ensure that we don't see a repeat of what happened in the 60s when it comes to
Right.
safety. Um,
So, if I might add, right?
yes.
So, back then, they figured out real fast that instead of mounting the wings to the chassis, which is what the wings are today, they're mounted solid on the chassis itself. What they did was is that they put these wings way up in the air. I mean, like several feet in the air, like 3 or 4 feet above the tops of the rear tires, way up there on little narrow skinny I'm going to call them stalks right, almost looks like little poles that were attached directly to the suspension so that the wings would provide the maximum amount of downforce onto that rear suspension instead of pushing down on the chassis, which you don't have to think about it very hard to see that that would be a much more effective solution. And then, just to make it interesting, they let the car have adjustable wings so that the wing would lay flat going down the straightaway, just as the new 2026 rules are saying. And then in the corners, the driver would activate a switch and the wing would increase its angle of attack. In other words, the nose would go down, the tail of the trailing edge of the wing would go up, and it would suddenly produce scads and scads of downforce. Well, what would happen was it began producing so much downforce that those little spindly stalks that those wings were mounted on broke because they were producing so much downforce. And all of a sudden, the driver who was expecting to have, let's say, 1,000 pounds of downforce directly working on the suspension suddenly had none and went straight off the track. So in these regulations, yes, the wings will be adjustable, but they will be mounted in much more solid mounting points that will be on the chassis. Because think about it, if you mount it directly on the suspension, every time the suspension goes over a bump, that wing is flopping around in the air because it's following the path of the suspension. So those drivers back in those days, you can say two things about them. They were brave beyond belief, and they probably had a distinct lack of imagination.
I mean, my jaw is down to the floor. And I feel like even when you talked about this, when we did the Aero 101 and we said that, I remember being shocked. But even as you walked us through, like you're expecting to have that high downforce and then all of a sudden it's gone, that instant change that the drivers have to be able to deal with. That's crazy, amazing. And I'm glad to hear that also it's not being connected to the suspension, as you said, flopping with the
Yeah.
suspension. Oh, wow. Well, maybe the full circle can work. I'm willing to stay optimistic, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Let's
Okay. All right.
see.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the next question I have is you said the arches regarding the wheel will be removed. Can you give a little bit of a description? Because I think I know what you're talking about, but I want to
Yeah,
make
it's
sure we
the
all are on the same page.
Yeah, just think of if you look at any of the modern Formula One cars that we've got right now,
Hmm.
it looks like the front tires are covered by fenders,
Right.
and those fenders are going away.
Oh, which have been problematic at times when there have
Mm-hmm.
been touch points between cars. Okay, then you said that, oh, I have to agree with you that I don't like the idea of sound being even more muted than what we currently have. That makes me
Yep.
disappointed because that is something I really do enjoy. The next thing I wanted is two things that I believe I'm understanding could be used tactically in a race, which is the electrical component. Even now, we hear the commentators noting that maybe a driver is charging up their batteries so that way they
Right.
can take the overtake, right? So based off of what you're saying, if there's a higher reliance on the electrical, that's going to be even more a racecraft and communication between driver and team
Oh
skill that's
yeah.
going to need to be really attuned, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit concerned for the drivers because you think about, okay, they're steering the car around a track, they're upshifting and downshifting, they're managing the energy, and they're deciding when to deploy the wings for a corner and when to lay them flat for a straightaway. They're already busy as it is, but now their workload's going up.
Yeah, I agree. It just seems like there's so many multitasking
Hmm.
that needs to be done, and you're increasing the speed. Because I think it was a conversation you and I had offline, just even the steering wheel in comparison to past years
Oh yeah.
and what they're having to do and remember. I don't know. It was fascinating to me to hear you say that this electrical component, when we talk about the concerns about safety and skill and all that. Okay, so the other thing that I'm wondering is I feel like you said the braking aspect, and I agree. It seemed listening to you that I don't have some of the weapons, or not weapons, that sounds wrong, tools in my toolkit that I've been accustomed to. Now braking in the slow corner may be the place that we're going to start seeing more overtakes.
Right.
But then going back to what you said about the overtake and the design of tracks and what George is bringing up of the speed, that also could increase the higher probability of crashes of people trying to brake at a different point where they can do that more tactical. Do you see where I'm trying to,
Yeah,
am I
yeah.
on
I
the
mean,
right track?
yeah, you're absolutely on the right track because, I think anytime that you have a greater differential between the speed that you approach a corner at and the speed that you can take it, that gives you an overtaking opportunity, right? So if you had think of it, even in today's cars, if you had a straightaway like the one in Miami on their back straight, where they go down that long straightaway and then they've got a pretty tight corner to the left at the end of it. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
braking that they have to do. But even so, with the brakes they have on Formula One cars today, I mean, they're braking very deep into the corner. But now, if they were suddenly doing another 50 miles an hour faster, they have no choice but to brake earlier. So there's a bigger delta, not only to get slowed down for the corner, but then they're not going to be able to go as fast in the corner as it is. So instead of slowing down from 190 miles an hour down to 60, a 30-mile-an-hour delta, maybe now they're slowing down from 240 down to 50. So that's 190 miles an hour. So that
Mm-hmm.
extra distance actually gives you a little bit more of an opportunity to try to attempt to outbrake your opponent and pull off a pass.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Wow. All right. So here now that's from your assessment and your opinions. Now help me with some questions that I think would be helpful for newer fans to understand them, especially people who they may have entered the sport in the last 2, 3 years, maybe while
Right.
the most recent rule change happened. This is a work in progress. So that I think
Yep.
we need to help people understand that even what was announced is not final. There's going to still be
Right.
deliberations between the FIA, F1, the teams. And I don't know if you saw the same article I saw this morning or this afternoon that noted that some of the timing of this may be related to the Concord Agreement. And
Mm.
because that was going to, if it came in July, this would now have to, and it would be considered part of Concord, which would then open up much more discussions and it would have to be dealt with, I think, by October, which then if there wasn't all this ironed out or the ability for all the commentary to happen from between the FIA, F1 and the teams, they would only have that short 2-month window before the teams had to ramp up development. And so there was some of this timing is what I was understanding, and I could totally be wrong, but my understanding was that was part of the reason why this came out as early as it did to give teams the ability to start thinking through how they're going to move.
Right.
But all that to say, that was kind of the lead up to my
Yeah.
question is for those who haven't seen reg changes like this, what is your historical experience of watching the sport, seeing about how this kind of works itself?
Well, because Formula One wants to be the pinnacle of the sport, they also want to be relevant to manufacturers because
Mm-hmm.
obviously the more manufacturers in joining the party, the better, right? It just makes the sport prosper even more. And so they went through a long process several years ago saying, what do we want to be when we grow up? What do we need to do from an engine perspective that would draw the interest of more manufacturers? And so they actually had a working body who talked with not only, the engine suppliers that we have today, Ferrari, Mercedes, and Alpine / Renault, but they also invited other manufacturers like Volkswagen, Audi, into these conversations. And they said, look, where do you think car technology is going to go in the future in terms of the propulsion unit used for street cars? And what they arrived at is that they still wanted to remain with the hybrid technology, but the current regs have two different ways of generating electrical power. One is the MGU, which is motor generator unit, MGU-K, which is K for kinetic, which is the energy generated by using the brakes. And then you have the MGU-H, which is heat, which is actually using the heat energy off of the turbochargers to generate electricity. Well, the MGU-H is really expensive and really difficult to get right. That's part of the reason why Mercedes had such a huge advantage for so long. Was because they were able to get it right, and why Honda, with its original engine, besides just the way it was packaged, it was also they just couldn't get it figured out. And so anyway, to make a long story short, they're getting rid of the MGU-H and they're just going to go with the kinetic because the manufacturers who were outside the sport didn't want to spend the money to go and develop something that they didn't feel like was relevant to road cars. And so what they've done is they've gone in and said, okay, we're going to develop a much more powerful electrical package that's going to be, 3x what they've got right now, which of course is going to necessitate a much bigger battery. So how do you advance that battery technology? That's going to be because you got to be able to package it in a relatively small Formula One car. So where do you do that? How do you do it and all that? And do you go to maybe instead of a battery, go to a supercapacitor? What does that look like? Those kinds of things. So that went on 4 or 5 years ago. The chassis regs have been something that has been relatively new. And of course, they've just been announced, whereas the engine regs have been out for a couple of years now. And so, with the concerns of the team managers, the team principals, concerns that people like George Russell is expressing, Fernando Alonso is expressing some concerns. There's going to be input solicited because the teams are not going to allow for these cars to wind up slower than Super Formula or IndyCar or be too close in performance to an F2 car.
Yeah, because that's what, as I was listening to you, I kept thinking is if this is supposed to be the pinnacle, why wouldn't we be operating starting from a baseline at least of whatever F2 or Super Formula is doing and saying we're just going to be sharper about it? That's the only word I can think of. It's not really the clearest word. It's not really the best word, but that's the only word I can think of. Like it's a little bit more elevated. So that was something I'm still trying to wrap my brain around. If it's F2.5, well, what's the value? Right. What's the value proposition there?
Right. Yeah. I mean, leave the chassis regulations pretty much alone as we got them today and find a way to modify the rules as simply as possible and stick the new engines in, stick the new power units in and off you go. I don't know if that's even possible, but, I mean, if you really wanted maybe the best of both worlds, okay, it'd be today's cars with the same downforce levels. They understand it. all that kind of good stuff. But now you have the new manufacturers joining and you've got the big horsepower,
Mm-hmm,
which, I mean, they're
mm-hmm.
going to have more horsepower. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, because that was another thought that I had is that we're just now in 2024 seeing some competitiveness
Right.
at the early part of the year.
Right.
Why are we changing? I know that the dates and all that kind of stuff were decided, but it feels like if the goal is to really push everybody, we're going to go back into a repeat. It feels like in 26 that whoever really does well will have that initial
Right.
head start.
Advantage. Yeah. They'll have the
Yeah.
advantage. Yeah.
And I mean, is that something you've seen over the decades of the sport that you've been
Yeah.
watching, that that's kind of
Yeah, it's pretty
typical?
normal. Pretty normal.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, a good example was like Braun. They
Mm.
were there, they did one season, but they got there right when the regs changed. They got it right and they absolutely destroyed everybody for the first half of the year. And they pretty much had an unassailable lead after that. It was perfect.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's not
Okay.
unusual.
Okay. Well, and I think that's good for newer fans to the sport to understand that this is the typical cycle. And that's part of the longevity of watching the sport, gives you the ability to realize, oh, this is when it's getting good. Like this is when you really want to pay attention and then and see how, as the rules change, who's going to get it right. And then you endure until, the field converges.
Right. I love the
Um,
way you put it. Yeah. Everybody else endures. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Okay. Well, so on that note,
Including
let
the
me ask.
fans.
That's right. It is. If anything, I have appreciated more and more by listening to you and John is that it's about it. This is not for the faint of heart kind of fan. You have to be
Mm-mm.
willing to put in the time to truly understand and appreciate what we're seeing and use your brain, but also, live in the moment of the race itself and enjoy it. But you
Yep.
also realize there's so much more happening behind the scenes that can allow you to appreciate what you see on race day. Okay, but on endurance, here's another question. So you talked about the tires and the tire size is changing, but is there going to be any discussion about like the compounds? The reason I ask is because we're hearing a lot about, oh, the tires are not enduring that long. It takes time to warm up. All that. Is that going to be a separate conversation because that's a tire manufacturer and we only have one tire manufacturer? And so that's not going to be discussed during this reg process.
Right. I mean, that will be a separate conversation between F1 and Pirelli, right?
Hmm.
But here's the thing. Yeah, okay, the cars are slightly lighter, but the downforce is going to be way less. So I suspect that you're going to be seeing a very different tire in terms of the sidewall construction and the compound
Hmm.
because they will look to the tires to gain back some of that lost grip from the aerodynamic download going away. And
Hmm.
also, if you don't have that aerodynamic download, but a tire that was designed to have all that downforce crushing the tire into the pavement,
Hmm.
you will not get that tire hot enough,
Right.
probably. And so you're going to have to go with a softer compound along all the ranges. That's just my guess.
That makes sense.
Right. The other piece is if that car is now suddenly doing 250 miles an hour instead of 200 miles an hour, it's going to be spinning a whole lot faster, right? And
Hmm.
so, what does that do to the construction of the tire? Because the centrifugal force that's on it has gone up by
Mm.
I guarantee it's more than any 25%. The speed's gone up 25%, but I guarantee the centrifugal force, and I'm not smart enough to figure that out, but I guarantee you there's somebody out there thinking, ooh, we need to be thinking about this now.
As I listen to you and everything that I've been hearing before that, it feels like that's one of the missing components to this conversation that hasn't really been unpacked to the
Right.
general fan, I feel, is because it's the three things that we have to think about are the chassis and the engine and the tire, right?
Right.
Those are the three. And if they're switching from a ground effect era to now an active aero, so you've changed the chassis and then we've already seen the changes in the engine, it seems like the next component would be a discussion of, okay, now you've got those two done, or at least decided or in progress. Now, how are we going to approach the tires to take into account that really it is going to be a different type of car?
While we were talking, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, what would really make the most sense and probably reduce development cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is you go with the chassis regulations regulations that you have adapted to this new power unit package. Give them the front and rear wings from the original 2026 regulations. In other words, a much simpler wing. It's only 2 elements at the front instead of however 4 that they're running right now. And let them have the active aero, right? The adjustment for the front and rear wings instead of DRS. And the narrower tires, fine, go racing. You know, they understand ground effects, and certainly with the simpler wings, it's going to change the aero underneath the car, no doubt. But it's going to, I mean, you know, let's face it, the safety cell going to be roughly the same. You know, if they really wanted to reduce the cost a lot, and I realize we're talking Formula One here, so I'm, you know, it's probably a joke, but the more I think about it, the more sense it actually makes. So they'll never do it.
Well, you would think then maybe the teams that are at the back of the grid and needing to try to work their way up to the grid under this new cost cap era, they would be thinking like that, wouldn't you? If I were in their position, I'd be wanting to figure out a way of how much have I already invested in that instead of it being totally scrapped, I can be making the modifications so that way my, you know, capital investment essentially has not been totally wasted. The other part is what you talked about, George Russell's concern about, you know, street circuits. That also seems like a very valid concern and goes back to what you're saying about simply just modifying versus a dramatic change that it seems like this would end up being.
And one of the things we haven't talked about is the race promoters. How much money are they going to have to spend to create all that extra runoff area?
Exactly.
In a place like Baku or Jeddah.
Correct.
Holy smokes, right? How do you do that?
Right. Well, and that's actually was going to be my question. Was if I were the race promoter who just signed a deal last year to extend for 5 years or 6 years or whatever the longest term is, and especially if I was a street circuit, would I be happy to hear that now I've got to really make these reconfigurations? Then the trickle-down effect is, what is that for us as fans who would like to go to the races? The cost is going to be eaten by the fans, which could be a whole other conversation about the behind-the-scenes political conversations of all the ways that they have to negotiate. But again, I feel like every conversation I go, oh, that'll have to be another one, which I appreciate you taking the time to at least start unpacking this. We'll hear from our listeners if they think that we should continue this and revisit this as new information. I would even say if anybody's getting additional information, you're welcome to shoot it our way and we'll review it. We'd be very happy to hear if we're looking at something. Well, I shouldn't say we, because I don't understand it nearly as much as Dick does. But if you want to send the extra work to the professor, I'll be happy to be the PA for that and get that to you. And we'll do another conversation.
That's right. I'll grade your paper.
Thanks. Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, sabrina@2guysagirlandf1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.